In 1992, communism fell in Russia. I remember listening to it on the radio. The people of Russia excitedly thought embracing capitalism would quickly move them toward the wealthy lifestyle seen on American TV and MTV. They sadly didn't realize that capitalism relies on scarcity and inequality. The global market was already saturated and few protections were put into place for domestic wealth building, and a tiny percentage in Russia got super rich while the rest advanced but at a crawl. This is why the only just war is one that increases not only democracy and freedom, but also income equality, as one cannot eat their vote or live on their free speech. Nostalgia for old times will ensure people will be happy to give up their freedoms and democracy for stability. They may have been better off switching to capitalism while keeping their cooperatives, or trying Chilean-style communism, or Norwegian-style capitalism where the government owns 80% of all shares of any business and is considered one of the top countries to do business in, than trying our modern capitalism. Russia had a brief 2-decade fling with democracy, but it went counter to the very core of Russia. Russia has been authoritarian by necessity since before its founding. It is mostly flat plains in its main body, which made it the whipping boy of Europe, until it used the strategy of expansion to take and keep geological barriers as defenses. See the video below in the Caspian Report. If you don't understand this, nothing will make sense about Russian geopolitics. Part of the strategy to maintain these regions was to pit the local tribes or kingdoms against each other, who hated each other, but if they had worked together, Russia wouldn't have had a chance in hanging on to the area. During the Soviet era, they became masters of these techniques of keeping people divided so they wouldn't rise up. They also became masters of propaganda and state-sanctioned misinformation along with intimidation on a Gestapo level. After a decade of freedom and democracy, the Russian people elected an authoritarian who despises both freedom and democracy and has said such, but finds it useful to keep it in place for legitimacy. The Russian people got nostalgia for a time that never really was, and he was able to gain more and more power over the last 16 years, to the point that he pretty much owns the media. His tactics to maintain power include using his KGB training to pit other parties against each other so they won't come together to defeat him, to spread misinformation and propaganda on state-run media, and then when a person does stand a chance to run against him, the person will get imprisoned for corruption charges or end up mysteriously dead. 2 known assassinations of Russians who defected have occurred in the past decade on British soil. Upon being elected, Putin knew Russia was a shell of its former power. His military was in relative shambles. NATO was expanding rapidly. The Baltic states were joining the EU, as were the Eastern Bloc. Ukraine and the Caucasus regions were also getting friendly with the West. The dogma of keeping a protective buffer zone scared him, and saw the potential invasion as possible, even if the rest of the world was oblivious to the thought of it, as you don't ever start a land war in Asia. Militarily, he didn't have a chance, unless he wanted a mutually assured nuclear destruction. But there was this new technology that spread information and made security a lot easier to access remotely, and the KGB was brilliant when it came to infiltration and propagation. That became their strategy. Hacking, trolling, and misinformation became their attack strategy. Then the Bush administration began doing things such as the Patriot Act, torture, and the invasion of a sovereign nation. And as the US had always been the bastion and standard of world morality since the 40s, Putin started doing it, and justifying the human rights abuses and invasion of Georgia is exactly what the US was doing. We were found to be spying on and hacking our allies. Russia could do it too. We were suspected to have spread information to help fuel the Arab Spring. Putin could do that too. He had all the justification he needed to ramp up his attack on the US, doing to the US what we had done to the rest of the world, yet with the KGB's blatant ability to lie in the face of strong evidence. They began setting to work to influence public opinion across the world. Luckily for them, what was a strength of the Anglo-centric world, that being English was the most common second language in the world, and young Russians were raised on American Hollywood movies and the internet, he had a nation's worth of cynical, disappointed Russians who could pose as Americans on the internet using a form of propaganda perfected by the carbon energy industry. Increasing partisanship along many fractured lines, creating purists, was essential to the plan. The West already had misinformation news in place. Fox News, Alex Jones, the Daily Mail, and other extreme right-wing lie machines that made people afraid of nothing and overemphasized the concern one should have while ignoring genuine concerns, as psychology shows that the average person can be really bad at calculating risk levels. But the young people were buying that less and less. They were becoming more and more liberal, also less religious. What he had to do was to split the old liberals and the young liberals, and replace pragmatism with idealism or cynicism, and get enough people not to vote. We don't have enough evidence that Russia had anything to do with Brexit. The Daily Mail and other outlets were already in full swing, selling anti-EU lies such as the Parliament was unelected when the British people have a massive voice in the EU Parliament through direct Republican democracy, while they still had a parasitic unelected House of Lords. However, 2012 was when you started to see the rise of what became the alt-right. Race realists, extreme anti-feminists, and trolls just getting plain nasty and multiplying like flies. Many pretending to just be asking questions, and many of us science-minded people wanting open dialogue let them. While science journals found that allowing trolls on increased the levels of partisanship in the comments section because they looked as if their group was making legitimate, thoughtful arguments, especially if multiple people were doing it, even when those multiple people were often just one person with multiple accounts. So what the heck does this have to do with Bernie? Tune in tomorrow.